Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty major on the geopolitical front. India's decision to suspend the Indus Waters Treaty with Pakistan.
It's a huge move. We've got some analysis suggesting this is, well, a really dramatic escalation.
Definitely. And it comes, of course, after those awful killings of tourists in Jammu and Kashmir. India's pointing the finger at Pakistan, alleging cross-border terrorism involvement.
Right, and this suspension feels like a very, very firm response, maybe even unprecedented given the history here. It really calls into question this long-standing water agreement.
An agreement that somehow managed to stick around through so much, hasn't it?
Absolutely. It was brokered by the World Bank way back in 1960. Think about it. It survived multiple wars, countless diplomatic crises between the two.
So putting it on hold now, that's a serious shift. Our goal today, then, is to really dig into this. What are the legal knots India's facing?
Yeah.
What could the strategic fallout look like? And, the wider geopolitical ripples this might cause.
Okay, so starting with the legal side. It's not exactly straightforward, is it?
No, not at all. The fascinating thing right off the bat is that the treaty itself, the IWT, it doesn't actually have an explicit get-out clause for one side just deciding to leave.
Ah, okay.
Article 12, paragraph 4, specifically says the treaty stays in force unless both India and Pakistan agree to end it with a new ratified treaty.
So India can't just unilaterally say we're done. That puts them in a bit of a legal bind if they want to completely scrap it.
Seems like it. A big hurdle. But the analysis we've seen suggests they might be looking at other avenues. Something about the Vienna Convention.
Precisely. That's where some Indian analysts are pointing. They're looking at Articles 60 and 62 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, the VCLT.
Okay, break those down for us. Article 60 is?
Article 60 deals with terminating or suspending a treaty if the other party commits a material breach, breaks a fundamental rule.
Right, and Article 62?
That one's about a fundamental change of circumstances. Something so drastic happens that it undermines the whole basis of the treaty.
So the argument would be, I suppose, that Pakistan's alleged actions, the terrorism links, count as either that material breach or that fundamental change.
That seems to be the potential line of reasoning, yes. But here's where it gets complicated.
How so?
Well, first off, India actually isn't a signatory to the Vienna Convention itself.
Well, that's awkward.
It is, and Pakistan has signed it. But crucially, they haven't ratified it. So trying to use specific VCLT articles is, let's say, legally and diplomatically tricky.
Right. You can't really enforce rules from a club you haven't fully joined, or that the other party hasn't fully committed to either, especially without ironclad proof that everyone agrees on.
Exactly. It feels like somewhat shaky legal ground internationally.
Okay. So Pakistan's not just going to accept this, presumably. What's their likely move?
Unsurprisingly, no. They've already signaled they'll fight this. Their Minister of State for Law and Justice mentioned challenging it internationally.
Where would they go?
Potentially the World Bank, since they brokered the original treaty, or maybe the Permanent Court of Arbitration, even the UN Security Council. Their argument will be that India's move violates international law.
Including maybe the principles in the Vienna Convention, even if the ratification isn't there?
Potentially, yes. Arguing the principles themselves are customary international law. So, yeah, a legal battle seems pretty much on the cards.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Setting aside the legal wrangling, what about the actual on-the-ground impact? Strategically, environmentally, what could happen if India pushes ahead?
Well, think about the water itself. The suspension, even if it's temporary, could give India much more control over those western rivers, the Indus, the Jhelum, the Chenab.
And under the treaty, their use of those rivers is quite restricted now, isn't it?
Very restricted. It's mainly for things like hydropower, non-consumptive uses, basically. Limited irrigation, limited storage.
But if the treaty's suspended, those limits could disappear.
Theoretically, yes. India could, for instance, hold back water during the crucial dry seasons. That could potentially cause artificial droughts downstream in Pakistan.
Or the opposite.
Or the opposite.
Yeah.
Release huge amounts during the monsoon season, which could increase flood risks significantly.
And Pakistan is heavily dependent on those rivers, right?
Hugely dependent. Their entire agrarian economy relies on them. Plus drinking water, electricity, the impact could be really, really severe.
That sounds deeply concerning. And doesn't Pakistan have its own internal water issues already?
It does, yes. There are already significant, sometimes quite tense water disputes between provinces, especially Punjab and Sindh. Things like arguments over new canals have already caused trouble.
So disruption coming from upstream, from India,
Yeah.
that could just pour fuel on the fire internally?
It absolutely could. It could make those internal tensions much worse, potentially leading to more domestic instability within Pakistan. A serious knock-on effect.
So while India might see a strategic advantage, the instability it could create in the neighborhood is a major factor. Now, the analysis also mentions something interesting in India's own limitations. Their infrastructure isn't necessarily ready to fully use all this water, even if they suspend the treaty.
That's a really key point.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between what the IWT allows India on the western rivers and what they can actually do right now.
How so? What are the numbers?
Okay, so for storage, the treaty lets India build up to about 3.6 million acre-feet, MAF. But their current actual storage capacity on those rivers, it's only around 1 MAF.
Wow, quite a gap.
And it's similar for irrigation. They're allowed to develop about 1.34 million acres, but they've only developed maybe 0.64 million acres so far. So the entitlement's there on paper, but the pipes and dams aren't fully built out yet.
So they have the theoretical right, but not the immediate physical means to, say, divert huge amounts of water.
Not immediately, no. It's very different from the eastern rivers, the Sutlej, Beas, and Ravi. There, India's built massive projects like the Bhakra and Pong dams and uses over 90% of its allocated share.
And the projects on the western rivers are different types of dams?
Mostly, yes. Things like Kishanganga, Radal, Baglahar. They're mainly run-of-the-river projects. Think of them as generating power for the river's natural flow, but with limited capacity to store large volumes of water for long periods.
But there are plans for bigger dams, right? The analysis mentioned some future projects.
There are definitely ambitious plans. Dams like Kiru and Pakal Dol are intended to significantly boost that storage capacity.
But how soon could those make a difference?
Well, that's the thing. These are major projects in difficult terrain. There are geographic challenges, bureaucratic hurdles. Realistically, getting them fully built and operational could easily take a decade, maybe even longer.
Okay. So any idea that India can immediately turn off the tap or drastically alter flows because of this suspension? That's probably overstating their current capability.
In the short term, yes. The infrastructure limitations are quite real. It seems more like a long-term strategic signal, perhaps, than an immediate hydraulic weapon.
Right. Let's widen the lens again, then, geopolitically. What kind of precedent does this set? Could it affect India's relationships beyond Pakistan?
Oh, absolutely. Suspending a treaty this significant, one that's been a cornerstone of regional water management for decades, that sends ripples. Other neighbors will definitely be watching closely.
And thinking about their own water-sharing agreements with India.
You'd have to assume so. Trust is, pretty fundamental in these cross-border water deals. This kind of move could erode that trust.
The analysis specifically flags China. China's upstream from India on several major rivers. What's the concern there?
Well, China might see this and think, okay, if India can suspend a treaty like the IWT, maybe we can be less cooperative too.
How might that manifest?
The big concern is hydrological data. China shares data with India on rivers like the Sutlej and the Brahmaputra, which is vital for flood warnings. They could potentially withhold that data, or maybe delay renewing the agreements, the MOUs that cover data sharing.
Has that happened before?
There's a worrying precedent, yes. During the Doklam standoff in 2017, China did stop sharing water data with India for a period, even while they continued sharing it with Bangladesh downstream.
Right, that's a stark example of water being used as a political lever. What about Bangladesh itself? There's a major treaty renewal coming up soon, isn't there?
There is. The Ganga Water Treaty is due for renewal in 2026. Any perception that India is taking a more aggressive stance on shared waters could definitely complicate those negotiations.
Bangladesh will be watching this Indus situation very carefully, you'd imagine.
No doubt. It adds a layer of tension or caution to those upcoming talks.
And it's not just countries with major treaties, is it? The analysis suggests even places like Nepal or Sri Lanka might view things differently.
That's plausible. They might just become more cautious, perhaps demand more rigorous scrutiny or stronger guarantees in any future water or infrastructure projects involving India. It could shift the diplomatic mood.
So this single act of suspending the IWT, while aimed squarely at Pakistan, it could have these much broader, perhaps unintended, consequences for India across the region.
It really could. It highlights how interconnected everything is, especially when it comes to shared resources like water.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the main takeaway from this deep dive?
Well, it seems India's suspension of the IWT is, without question, a bold move. A real assertion of strategic sovereignty, perhaps driven by domestic pressures too.
Yeah, projecting strength against terrorism probably plays well at home. But as we've discussed, it's also a pretty high-stakes gamble, isn't it?
Very high stakes. You've got the uncertain legal footing we talked about. You've got the fact that their own infrastructure limits immediate impact on the western rivers.
And then there are these potentially significant negative geopolitical consequences, alienating neighbors, creating precedents they might not like later on.
Exactly. All those factors need to be weighed against whatever perceived benefit the suspension offers.
So it leaves us, and you listening, with a fundamental question, really. In a region like South Asia, so reliant on shared rivers, what's the better path to long-term water security? Is it these kinds of unilateral, assertive actions?
Or is it ultimately about finding ways to cooperate, manage these vital resources sustainably, even with difficult neighbors? It's definitely something to think about.
A lot to consider indeed. Thanks for exploring this really complex issue with us today.